Emma was in the middle of folding laundry when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She wiped her hands on her jeans and picked it up, frowning slightly when she saw her mother-in-law's name flashing on the screen. Linda wasn't the type to call without a reason, and Emma had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Hello," she answered, tucking the phone between her shoulder and ear as she reached for another shirt to fold. "Emma, hi," Linda's voice came through, a little too cheerful, a little too rehearsed. "How are you, dear?" "I'm fine. What's up?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm Emma's suspicion that something was coming. "Well," Linda started, her voice dropping into a softer, almost conspiratorial tone, "Tom and I have been planning this trip to Hawaii for months now. You know, we haven't had a real vacation in years, and with everything going on, we really need this break." Emma felt a small flicker of irritation. She knew about the trip. Linda had mentioned it in passing, but only in the context of vague plans. Nothing confirmed. "That sounds nice," Emma said cautiously, waiting for the real reason behind the call. "It is," Linda agreed quickly. "But here's the thing, sweetheart. You know how my father's been, well, not in the best condition lately." Emma stiffened slightly. Of course she knew. George, her father-in-law, had been bedridden for several months now after a bad fall. His mobility had been severely limited, and though he wasn't completely helpless, he needed assistance with most daily tasks. Linda had been taking care of him, but Emma had noticed the frustration in her mother-in-law's voice whenever she spoke about it. "I do," Emma said carefully. "Well, since Tom and I will be gone for 2 weeks, I was hoping you could look after him while we're away." Emma blinked. The laundry in her hands suddenly felt heavier. "You want me to take care of George?" she repeated, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "Just for a little while," Linda rushed to say. "It won't be difficult. He mostly stays in bed, and the nurse comes twice a week. You'd just have to make sure he eats, takes his medication, and, keep him company." Emma hesitated. She liked George, but they had never been particularly close. He was a reserved man, not unkind, but not exactly warm either. She had always gotten the impression that he tolerated her rather than truly accepted her as family. "I don't know, Linda," Emma bit her lip. "I mean, I have work and—" "Oh, I know, but you work from home, right? It wouldn't be a full-time thing. He's really independent, as much as he can be. He just needs someone around in case of emergencies." Emma sighed, rubbing her forehead. She wanted to say no, but something in Linda's tone, almost desperate, made her pause. It wasn't like Linda to ask for help. "Isn't there someone else, a professional caregiver?" "We tried," Linda said, her voice tight, "but everyone's booked up. And we really can't cancel this trip. Tom's been so stressed with work, and she exhaled sharply, "I just need this, Emma." Emma closed her eyes. She felt cornered. Saying no would make her look selfish, and she wasn't heartless. She knew taking care of George wasn't easy, and she could hear in Linda's voice that she was at her limit. "Okay," Emma said finally, the word tasting heavy in her mouth. Oh, thank you, sweetheart. I knew I could count on you." Linda sounded so relieved that Emma almost felt guilty for hesitating. "I'll write everything down for you. His schedule, his medications, everything. It'll be easy, I promise." Easy? Somehow Emma doubted that. 2 days later, Emma stood in the doorway of George's room, clutching a notepad filled with Linda's scribbled instructions. The room smelled of old books and antiseptic, a combination that made it feel more like a hospital than a bedroom. George was propped up against several pillows, his face turned toward the window, staring out at nothing in particular. "Hi, George," Emma said, forcing a smile. He didn't turn his head. "Linda's gone, I take it?" "She and Tom just left for the airport," Emma confirmed. Emma waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. "Well, I'll be taking care of you while they're away." She tried to keep her voice light, but George's lack of reaction made her uneasy. "I see." Silence stretched between them. "Do you need anything?" she asked. "No." Emma shifted on her feet. This was going to be a long 2 weeks. The first day was rough. George barely acknowledged her presence, answering in grunts and one-word responses whenever she asked if he needed anything. She brought him meals, made sure he took his medication, but beyond that, he made no effort to interact. By the third day, Emma was frustrated. She wasn't expecting heartfelt conversations, but the least he could do was acknowledge that she was helping him. That afternoon, as she set down his lunch tray, she couldn't hold back anymore. "You know, I didn't have to do this," she said, crossing her arms. George glanced at her for the first time since she arrived. Didn't have to do what? "Stay here, take care of you." "I could have said no," George scoffed. "Then why didn't you?" Emma hesitated. "Because Linda asked me to." "Ha!" He shook his head. "She just wanted to get rid of me for a while." Emma frowned. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" His voice was sharp. "She didn't want to deal with me, so she dumped me on you." Emma opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't want to admit it, but there was truth in his words. George sighed, looking away. "I don't need a babysitter." Emma sat down in the chair by his bed. "I'm not here to babysit you." "Then why are you here?" She didn't have an answer. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it felt different, less tense, more like an unspoken truce. That night, as Emma sat at the kitchen table going over Linda's notes again, she thought about the way George had looked at her. For the first time since she arrived, he had really looked at her. Maybe, she thought, this wasn't just about taking care of him. Maybe it was about understanding him too. And maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as impossible as she had first thought. The first few days with George had been frustrating. Emma had expected some level of difficulty. After all, he was a proud, independent man who had suddenly found himself reliant on others. But she hadn't expected the complete wall of silence he had put up between them. He barely spoke unless necessary, and when he did, his words were clipped and short, as if she were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. By the fourth day, Emma had settled into something resembling a routine. Mornings were the hardest. George was at his most irritable then, grumbling under his breath as she helped him shift in bed or assisted with his medication. He hated being dependent on her, that much was clear. "You don't have to hover," he muttered as she set his breakfast tray on the bedside table. "I'm not hovering," Emma replied, keeping her tone even. "I'm making sure you eat. I can feed myself, I know, but I don't want you skipping meals." George let out a sharp exhale, not quite a sigh, but close. He picked up the spoon and stirred the oatmeal she had made, though he didn't seem eager to eat it. Emma sat down in the chair beside his bed. She had decided last night that if they were going to be stuck together for 2 weeks, she had to try harder. Maybe she couldn't make him like her, but she could at least get him to talk. "So," she started, watching him take a slow bite of oatmeal, "what did you do before you retired?" George glanced at her briefly before looking back at his food. "Worked in construction." "Really?" Emma perked up. "Tom never mentioned that." George let out a low chuckle. "Figures. He never cared much about what I did." Emma frowned. There was something in his tone. Resentment, maybe? She hadn't really thought much about George's relationship with his son before, but now that she was here, she was beginning to sense that it wasn't as warm as she had assumed. "What kind of construction work?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation back. George took another slow bite, chewing deliberately before answering. "Started as a laborer, moved up to site supervisor eventually, spent most of my life working on high-rises." Emma raised her eyebrows. "That's pretty impressive." He gave a small shrug. "It was a job, but a dangerous one, right? Weren't you ever scared working that high up?" For the first time since she had arrived, George seemed genuinely interested in the conversation. His face softened slightly as he leaned back against the pillows. "Not really. You get used to it. There's a rhythm to it. Steel beams, scaffolding, the wind. It all becomes part of the job." Emma nodded, encouraged by the fact that he was actually speaking to her like a person rather than an unwanted guest. "Did you ever have any close calls?" George's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Once. A beam slipped from the crane. Missed me by inches." Emma's eyes widened. "What happened?" "Nothing. Kept working." He let out a low chuckle at her expression. "That's the job, kid. You can't be afraid all the time." Emma shook her head in amazement. She had never known this about him. In all the years she had been married to Tom, she had never once heard a story about George's life before he became the quiet, tired man she knew now. She wanted to ask more, but just as she opened her mouth, George's expression hardened again. It was as if he had caught himself enjoying the conversation and had immediately decided to put his guard back up. "That was a long time ago," he said gruffly, setting his spoon down. "No point in talking about it now." Emma sighed inwardly. Progress, and then a step back, but at least it was something. Over the next few days, Emma tried to keep the conversations going. She learned bits and pieces about George, his love for classical music, his dislike for overly sweet foods, the fact that he used to love fishing before his health declined. Each little detail felt like a small victory, a chisel breaking away at the wall he had built around himself. But there were bad days too. Some mornings he was especially irritable, snapping at her over small things. Other times he refused to talk at all, staring out the window as if she wasn't even there. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. One evening, as she was tidying up his room, she noticed a small wooden box on his nightstand. It was old, the edges worn, the hinges slightly rusted. Curiosity got the best of her. "What's in here?" she asked, picking it up. George looked at the box, his expression unreadable. "Memories." Emma hesitated before opening it. Inside, she found old photographs, faded and yellowed with time. She pulled one out and studied it. A younger George stood beside a woman, their hands clasped together, both of them smiling at the camera. "Is this your wife?" she asked softly. George's eyes darkened. "Yes." Emma looked back at the picture. "She's beautiful." She was. Silence settled between them. Emma wanted to ask more, but sensed that the topic was painful. She carefully placed the photo back in the box and closed the lid. "I'm sorry," she said. George exhaled slowly. "It's been a long time. But some things don't fade." Emma nodded. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that lingered, even when you thought you had moved past it. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she thought about everything she had learned about George in just a few days. He wasn't just an old man stuck in bed. He had a life, a history, stories that no one had bothered to ask him about in years. And for the first time since she had agreed to take care of him, she didn't just see it as a responsibility. She saw it as an opportunity to understand him, and maybe, in some way, to help him feel like himself again. Emma had settled into a routine with George, but things were still far from easy. Some days he was more talkative, sharing small snippets of his past, but other days he withdrew completely, retreating into his silence like a man waiting out a storm. Emma had learned to be patient, to take what she could get without pushing too hard. Then, on the 10th day of her stay, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Emma was in the kitchen, making tea when she heard George's voice from his room. It was low, tense, different from his usual gruff tone. She wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but something about the way he was speaking made her pause. "I told you I don't need another appointment," he said, his voice sharp. A pause. "No, I don't care what she said. I don't need therapy, I'm fine." Emma frowned, setting the teapot down. Who was he talking to? She stepped closer to the hallway, listening. Yes, I understand. No, I don't want her involved. Just tell Linda I'm fine and that's the end of it. Another pause. I said, "That's the end of it." A moment later, she heard the dull thud of the phone being placed back on the receiver. Emma quickly stepped back into the kitchen, her heart pounding. She knew she shouldn't have listened in, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A minute later, she walked into George's room, forcing her expression into something neutral. He was staring at the window again, his jaw tight. "Everything okay?" she asked casually. George glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Fine." Emma hesitated. She knew if she pushed too hard, he'd shut down completely, so she tried a different approach. "You know," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "when I broke my ankle a few years ago, I had to do months of physical therapy. Hated every second of it." George didn't respond, but she saw the way his fingers twitched slightly. "The worst part wasn't even the pain," she continued. "It was feeling like I wasn't in control of my own body anymore, like I was stuck, waiting for someone else to tell me when I could walk again." George exhaled through his nose, still not looking at her. "It sucked," Emma added. "But eventually I got better, because I stuck with it." She let her words hang in the air, giving him a chance to respond. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, George muttered, "It's not the same." Emma's heart leapt. A crack in the wall. "No," she admitted, "it's not. But it's not hopeless, either." George shook his head, his expression darkening. "You don't get it." "Then help me understand." For a moment, she thought he was going to ignore her. But then, with a slow, weary sigh, he spoke. "They told me I might never walk again," he said flatly. "That physical therapy might help, but no guarantees." Emma's stomach twisted. Linda hadn't told her that. She had made it sound like he was just weak, like he needed help with basic things, not that he was fighting against something this serious. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. George scoffed. "Sorry doesn't change anything." "No," Emma agreed, "but maybe trying does." George didn't reply. The conversation was over. But Emma had heard enough to know the truth now, and she wasn't going to let it go. That evening, after George had fallen asleep, Emma sat in the living room, staring at Linda's list of instructions. Something about this whole situation wasn't adding up. George wasn't helpless. He was weak, sure, but she had seen moments where he moved more than Linda had claimed he could. And now, after hearing that phone call, she had a sinking feeling that there was more going on than she had been told. She grabbed her phone and hesitated before dialing Linda's number. It was late, but she needed answers. After 3 rings, Linda picked up. "Emma?" She sounded groggy, like she had just woken up. "Is everything okay?" Emma took a breath. "I need to ask you something. About George." There was a pause, just long enough to confirm that Linda wasn't thrilled about this conversation. "What about him?" Emma chose her words carefully. "I overheard a phone call today, with his doctor." Linda was silent. "He said he doesn't need therapy, that he doesn't want another appointment." Emma swallowed. But it sounded like someone else was pushing for it. Linda sighed. "Emma, I don't know what you think you heard, but this isn't your business." "He thinks he has no chance of getting better," Emma pressed. "But that's not true, is it?" Another pause, then finally Linda muttered, "No, it's not." Emma's grip on the phone tightened. "Then why?" "Because he won't try," Linda interrupted. "Emma, do you know how exhausting it's been? For months I've been pushing him to go to therapy, to work on his strength, but he won't listen. He's given up. He just sits there, wasting away, and She broke off. When she spoke again, her voice was tight. "I can't do it anymore. I can't force him." Emma exhaled. She understood Linda's frustration, but she also understood something else. George wasn't just being stubborn. He was scared. "I think he wants to try," Emma said. "He just doesn't know how." Linda let out a bitter laugh. Good luck with that. The call ended, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something important. George hadn't been left behind just because Linda wanted a vacation. She had left because she had given up on him, and now it was up to Emma to make him believe in himself again. The next morning, Emma made a decision. She walked into George's room and set a glass of water on his bedside table. He glanced at her, waiting for the usual routine, but she didn't move to adjust his pillows or bring him breakfast. Instead, she pulled up a chair and met his gaze. "We're going to do something different today," she said. George frowned. "What?" "I'm going to help you get stronger." George's expression darkened. "Emma." "No arguments," she cut in. "No excuses. We're starting small, just some movement. If you don't want to keep going, fine, but you have to try." George stared at her, his jaw clenched. For a moment she thought he was going to refuse, but then, with a long, slow exhale, he muttered, "Fine. One time." Emma smiled. That was all she needed. The first session was a disaster. Emma had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected just how much George would fight her on every little thing. When she suggested starting with simple arm movements, he scoffed. When she tried to help him sit up straighter, he grumbled that he was just fine as he was. And when she gently encouraged him to move his legs, he outright refused. "I told you," he muttered, staring at the ceiling. "It's pointless." Emma sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not pointless. You need to start somewhere." "I'm tired," he said flatly. Emma knew it wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was something deeper, the kind of tired that settled into a person's bones after months, maybe even years, of feeling like life had left them behind. She took a deep breath and leaned forward. "George, do you really want to spend the rest of your life in this bed?" He didn't answer. "Because that's what's going to happen if you don't try," she pressed. "I get it. You're scared. You don't want to hope for something that might not happen. But giving up completely? That's a guarantee that nothing will change." George's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but then, just as quickly, his face hardened again. "Linda already gave me this speech," he muttered. Emma hesitated. "Maybe she did, but she also gave up on you." That got his attention. His head turned slightly toward her, his brow furrowing. "What?" "She's tired too, George. She's been trying to push you, but you've been pushing back, and now she's done." Emma swallowed. "I don't think she left just for a vacation. I think she left because she didn't know what else to do." George's expression darkened. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "She should have just left me at a nursing home." Emma felt a sharp pang in her chest. "Is that really what you want?" He didn't answer. She let the silence stretch between them before sighing and standing up. "Fine. If you don't want to do this, I won't force you." She started toward the door, but paused before leaving. "But think about this, George. If you don't even try, then you're the one choosing to stay in this bed, not Linda, not your doctor, you." She left him with that thought and didn't bring it up again for the rest of the day. The next morning, something shifted. When Emma brought his breakfast, George sat up slightly on his own. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his arms trembled as he braced himself. He was trying. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did she, but when she suggested doing some light stretching after he ate, he didn't refuse. It was slow at first, painfully slow. His legs were weak, stiff from months of disuse. Every movement seemed to take everything out of him. But he was doing it. One small stretch at a time, one tiny victory after another. Emma was patient. She didn't push too hard, but she also didn't let him quit. And over the next few days, something remarkable happened. George started to change. It wasn't just his body. It was his attitude. He was still grumpy, still reluctant at times, but there was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Determination. One afternoon, as Emma helped him shift to the edge of the bed, he let out a strained breath and muttered, "You're annoying, you know that?" Emma smirked. "Yeah, I've been told." He huffed a laugh. An actual laugh. It was small, barely more than a chuckle, but it was real. And for the first time since she had arrived, Emma felt like she was finally getting through to him. By the time the end of the second week rolled around, George had made more progress than either of them had expected. He could sit up on his own now. He could move his legs more freely, and for the first time since his accident, he was able to stand. Just for a few seconds. Just with Emma's help. But it was something. The morning before Linda and Tom were supposed to return, George sat in his bed looking out the window as usual. But this time, there was something different about the way he sat. His shoulders weren't slumped. His eyes weren't dull. Emma sat down in the chair beside him. "You're going to keep going, right?" George was quiet for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will." Emma smiled. Neither of them said anything for a while. They just sat there, watching the world outside. That evening, Linda and Tom arrived home. Emma had expected Linda to be relieved, maybe even grateful. But the moment she walked through the door, her eyes landed on George, and she froze. He was sitting up, properly sitting up, not just leaning against his pillows. And when he looked at her, it wasn't with the same distant resignation he had before. "Dad?" Linda stepped forward cautiously, almost as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Are you—" "Getting better," George finished for her. His voice was steady, stronger. Lyndon's eyes flickered to Emma, confusion and something else, something like guilt crossing her face. "How?" Emma shrugged. "I didn't let him quit." Tom, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat. "Well, that's good, right?" George glanced at his son, his expression unreadable. "I suppose it is." An awkward silence followed. Emma could see it now, clearer than ever. There was distance between them, a rift that had formed long before George's accident. But something told her that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for them to fix it. Linda exhaled slowly and stepped closer to her father's bed. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "I really am." George nodded but didn't say anything. Emma took that as her cue to leave. She grabbed her bag from the kitchen and turned back to George. "You have my number if you need me." He met her gaze, and for the first time there was something in his expression that almost looked like gratitude. "I'll keep that in mind." Emma smiled. Then, without another word, she walked out the door. As she drove home, she thought about everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. She had come here expecting nothing more than an obligation, a burden placed on her by her in-laws, but she had left with something else entirely. She had helped George, yes, but in a way, he had helped her too. He had reminded her that people weren't always what they seemed, that sometimes all it took to change a person's life was someone willing to believe in them. And as she pulled into her driveway, exhausted but strangely fulfilled, she realized something. She would never look at George the same way again.